In August 2004, in the small town of Fayence near our factory, another antique fair was taking place. These fairs are regularly held in Fayence twice a year. The Fayence fair differs from the typical flea market because the level of items presented there is usually higher than at flea markets in France. However, this fair is still not intended for the sale of expensive items. The usual price limit there does not exceed 20,000 euros per item. On the wall of one of the fair pavilions, I noticed a portrait of remarkable power and quality. This work stood out dramatically from all the exhibits that were presented around it, and indeed differed from everything I had ever seen at fairs or auctions. So at first I assumed that this amazing portrait was not for sale. I assumed that it was displayed here only to attract attention to the seller's stand. However, the seller told me that this portrait could be bought. The painting had such power that I would have been willing to pay 100,000 euros or maybe more for it. Of course, my wife Irina and I didn't have that kind of money in our pockets, but we were willing to borrow it or sell one of our cars if necessary. However, the lovely lady selling this painting told my wife and me that it was only 4,000 euros. I gathered all my willpower and forced myself to negotiate slowly. I always advise collectors to negotiate in such cases because it brings not only commercial benefit to the buyer but also gives the seller the feeling that they didn't misjudge the price and set it correctly. In the end, we purchased this painting for 3,200 euros. I immediately tried to find out the origin and history of this work. However, the seller reluctantly and sparingly answered these questions, and I was extremely emotionally excited. Later, 6 months later, when we met this seller again at the next fair, I was forced to buy another painting from her that I didn't need. My wife and I bought the second painting just to talk about this portrait again. We paid 1,000 euros for it, and then we gave it to someone. I don't remember where it went afterward. Anyway, it was bad and not worth that much money. As a result of our efforts, we finally found out that this portrait of a bearded man in a red hood was brought to the Monaco gallery called Lola Antiquité 2 days before the fair in Fayence. Someone from the so-called experts of this gallery inspected the portrait without even removing it from the frame. The experts set the price at their discretion and dated this work to the 18th century. We also learned that the previous owner of this portrait had passed away, and the people who brought it to the gallery knew nothing about the portrait or its value. The previous owner was probably a very elderly woman who lived in Monaco, and she was probably a musician. That's all we managed to find out. Going ahead, I'll say that today this portrait has a notarized appraisal conducted by Italian auditors in the amount of 107 million euros. In the state of Gibraltar in 2021, 2 commemorative coins with this portrait were issued, one gold and the other silver, with a nominal value of £1. The silver coins are now sold for 40 or 50 euros. They can be found on eBay auctions, and I recommend buying them as the price will go higher. The gold coins are much more expensive, but I don't know their price. As soon as the portrait was in our hands, we immediately went home. My wife and I already fully realized at that moment that we had just become the owners of some unknown treasure. At home, we hung the portrait on the wall, and it immediately took over the entire space. In our grand hall, the portrait constantly drew eyes and emitted astonishing emotions and power. However, the frame of this portrait completely mismatched it, so I decided to remove the portrait from the frame. Doing this turned out to be not easy. The portrait was enclosed in a wooden frame which could be removed without much trouble. However, the problem was that there were 4 paper corners directly glued onto the portrait's front side. These corners, along with the frame, gave the portrait an oval appearance. That's why, due to the oval shape of the frame, the unskilled expert from the Monaco gallery probably concluded that the portrait belonged to the 18th century, not the 16th century, as it actually does. To remove these glued corners, a restorer was needed. However, I couldn't wait and practically tore them off the portrait myself. Of course, we photographed this portrait as we bought it, but our archive partially burned in the flames of the fire when the ART CARTEL burned down our factory. Fortunately, part of the archive was still preserved, but it is still in boxes smelling of smoke because I still haven't sorted it out. On one of the 4 corners, on its inner side, there is an inscription made in French, Head of a Man, Benvenuto Cellini. The inscription is in 2 different handwriting styles, and apparently this inscription was made relatively recently, presumably in the 20th century. Of course, this inscription cannot serve as a basis for attribution. However, firstly, it is a clue that was very useful in further research, and secondly, the inscription itself provides us with a lot of interesting information for thought. From the text of the inscription, it follows that the author of the inscription did not know that the portrait depicted the author himself, Benvenuto Cellini, but the author of the inscription knew that the author of this portrait was indeed Benvenuto. Moreover, information about authorship is not obvious. It is more difficult to obtain than to recognize the face of Benvenuto Cellini in the portrait. And if the author did not know that the portrait depicted Cellini himself but knew that this portrait was created by Benvenuto, then the question arises, where did the author of the inscription get this partial information from? Where is the source of this information? The solution is simple. This portrait is executed on thick, dense paper glued to canvas. Obviously, good restorers re-glued the portrait from an old, time-worn canvas onto a new canvas. This probably happened in the 20th century. Thus, the inscriptions that are on the back of the portrait paper were hidden by the canvas. However, previous owners saw these inscriptions. Based on the inscriptions, they definitely established that the author of this portrait was Benvenuto Cellini. Most likely, there is an autograph of Benvenuto on the back of the portrait. The inscriptions hidden by the canvas are the source of the information we are looking for. To read these inscriptions on the back of the portrait, it is necessary to remove the glued portrait from the canvas. We still haven't done this, and here's why. Firstly, for the attribution of the portrait, we have enough other data, and it is not necessary for us to remove the paper from the canvas. Attribution of authorship is based on a variety of scientific analyses, and the inscriptions on the back do not play any role. Secondly, this is a large and very risky restoration work that must be done in a museum laboratory under the supervision of a special committee. Thirdly, when the portrait is finally removed from the canvas, many mysterious secrets will be revealed. For example, we may find out who actually owned this portrait in the past, and thus we will understand how and why the Royal House of Windsor and Queen Elizabeth II's husband Prince Philip were involved in our quest. Removing the portrait from the canvas will be a sensation of global proportions, and my wife and I prefer to leave this event until the right time comes. And now, in the next video, I will say a few words about expertise and the rules of inspecting works of art. These rules allow skilled experts to make a thorough, high-quality attribution of a masterpiece rather than a hasty and erroneous conclusion based on subjective and incorrect opinions. Much of what I will talk about can be applied in practice by collectors and art enthusiasts. At least I taught this to customs officers and police officers far from the beauty. Subscribe to my channel, dear friends. The narrative intensity will only increase further.